Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today on our webinar. We're going to be talking about charting the consumer landscape, navigating trends and insights in 2024 and beyond. So we'll also take a look back at 2023 and then take a look at 2024 and what the consumer landscape is showing us. I am Dan Fleetwood. I'm the President of Research and Insights here at QuestionPro. And before I introduce my other colleagues that will be on the webinar today, I did want to take a moment and just do a few housekeeping items. If you have questions as we're going through this, feel free to put them in the comments or the chat on whatever platform you're viewing this on. We'll take a look at it and we'll have time at the end to answer those questions, and we'll even display them on screen. So when you think of those questions, put them in there. We'll try to get to as many as we can within the hour today. So without further ado, I'll let Jon go ahead and introduce himself.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's great to be back with both of you today. I'm Jon Last, and I'm the president of Sports and Leisure Research Group. We're in our 16th year now, hard to believe that, providing custom research and insights to a variety of clients in the sports and entertainment, leisure, and travel industries. And it's great to be with everybody today.
Excellent. And I'm Steve Kraus. I'm a professor at the University of San Francisco, where I teach in the School of Management. I teach primarily marketing to our graduate students in our MSMI program. That's Master of Science in Marketing Intelligence. And I have a background in market research. And formerly, I was executive director of MRII, the Market Research Institute International, a nonprofit devoted to education and training in market research. And that's really where I cross paths with Dan and Jon. It's a nonprofit they've been devoting their time to for many years. And so happy to be here today.
Awesome. Well, thank you, gentlemen. And with that, we can go ahead and get started here.
Excellent. Well, I will kick it off. You know, ever since I was a kid, New Year's was always my favorite holiday. That I just love the tradition of looking back at the year that was and trying to distill meaning from that and thinking ahead about the year to come, and people making New Year's resolutions and try to have more agency in their life and set goals and accomplish them. And this is actually a tradition that's been going on for a long, long time, dating back to the ancient Babylonians. In Roman times, they had a god named Janus, from whom we get the name of the month January. It's also god of doorways and beginnings. And Janus had two heads, one that looked forward and one that looked back. So that's kind of the theme that we'll look at today. We'll take a look at first key takeaways from 2023, and then we'll shift a little bit and talk about what we expect in the year to come. So yeah, it was quite a year, obviously. And, purely from a macroeconomic perspective, if we look at kind of the main metrics that economists and marketers and psychologists use to think about the health of the economy and consumer behavior, clearly things were really good. Unemployment at nearly historic lows. If we look at the stock market now at all-time highs, and kind of setting new highs, each of the last several days. If we think about other kind of macroeconomic indicators, inflation fell. Still an issue, end of the year at about 3.5%, which is substantial, but better than the 6 to 7% that we had in the past. Now, how consumers are psychologically thinking about inflation are a different issue, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. GDP rose, consumer spending rose. So on that sense, looking at the numbers, seems like everything's going great. But as we go ahead to the next slide, we'll see that from the consumer mindset, it feels like, the vibes are off. And the phrase that gets used a lot is the vibe session. And I did not invent that phrase. I wish I had, because I think it's a great phrase. It captures the essence of it. When polls have been conducted of leading economists, the vast majority were predicting a recession in 2023. Many are still predicting recession in 2024. So economists seem to have been left a little bit baffled by the fact that we didn't slip into a recession. But it feels like our mindset has slipped into a recession. Consumers are still down in the dumps, for lack of a better phrase, and not looking forward to the future with a great deal of optimism, which is another trend that we'll take a look at as we go on. So as we go ahead to the next slide, that consumers, still have plenty to worry about. And even on a macroeconomic perspective, not all of the indicators are as great as unemployment and the stock market. So consumer spending in many ways is back. And there was kind of pent up demand, obviously, throughout the pandemic. And so spending is back. But income is not necessarily up dramatically, certainly not discretionary income. And so consumers are spending more, but by and large, they're going into debt to do it. So you see a chart of consumer debt over on the right. And there are a lot of political and other kinds of things going on that contribute to that sense of angst that consumers have. Seems like every couple of months we have a debt ceiling crisis, which then highlights all the dysfunction going on in our federal government. You may remember this was the year back in March when Silicon Valley Bank imploded, and there were all kinds of headlines about, oh, this is it. It's going to be bad. It's going to trigger another, financial crisis. Fortunately, that didn't materialize, but it's definitely something that was worrying people and was on their minds. I don't need to tell you about the ongoing political turmoil. And this was, yet another hottest year ever. And, I'm not going to show you all of the various headlines about that, but, whether it's, North America, Europe, Asia, all the major regions showing, another hottest year ever. And again, I don't want to get too depressing, but a lot of climate scientists are now kind of relooking at their models and suggesting that maybe they were too cautious, too conservative in terms of how quickly things are going to change in terms of climate change. And of course, that doesn't just mean that the whole world gets a uniform 2 degrees hotter. It means tremendous variability, unpredictability, uncertainty, flash floods, forest fires. Maybe that's just me here in California. It just contributes to that sense of uncertainty and volatility. People who study the future often say that the future is VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's VUCA. And I think that really characterizes the consumer mindset and part of why we have this vibe session. So as we go ahead to the next slide, just shifting gears a little bit, but continuing with that theme of looking back at the year that was. It was a big year in popular culture. It was a year when many people returned to movie theaters. There were 3 really big movies. Of course, you all remember Barbenheimer, when Barbie and Oppenheimer, 2 very different movies, came out at the same time, but really generated a lot of enthusiasm for attending movies in person, something that had been absent for several years. And surprisingly, that actually the number 2 movie in terms of the box office was the Mario Brothers movie, which didn't make the same kind of headlines, but it speaks to the appeal of family entertainment. Just a little bit of data there on the right about what else people were doing. This was, continuation of a trend for several years where streaming has really overtaken consumer entertainment on the home front. You see a lot of the numbers there. Those are from Nielsen. You see the top 10 streaming shows, which also show, I think, kind of a real interest in nostalgia. Out of all those shows, there are only 2 that are still continuing to produce new original content. Grey's Anatomy, which just goes on and on and on. I actually took a break in 2023 because of all the strikes in Hollywood, but now it's going to be back in 2024. And Heartland, which you may not be familiar with, but a Canadian show that's been on for nearly 20 years now, continues to crank out new episodes. But I think you see in that general list a sense of looking for nostalgia, looking for comfort, looking for familiarity. So a lot of telling trends going on in the world of popular culture and entertainment. And of course, the big headline of the year in pop culture and entertainment. Dan, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if people have heard, but Taylor Swift had a tour last year that generated a significant amount of both revenue and economic impact. So if you hadn't heard, Taylor Swift was on tour in 2023, and QuestionPro did a big study around this, and found not only that concert goers were spending $1,300 per show, crazy amounts, generated $5 billion in economic impact. It's bigger than the GDP of 50 countries. You can see that concert goers would gladly go again, and 91% saying that they would spend this money and go to a concert again. So, huge amount of money being spent on Taylor Swift. And of course, we'll see that trend probably continue into 2024 with the onset of her, not global tours, but even when she comes back in the US later this year. So it was, definitely Swiftocomics and Swiftonomics, and then a whole bunch of things. So really interesting year for Taylor Swift. And then, Steve, going back to your slide, it's always amazes me how like Grey's Anatomy and Heartland are still on. So that's a trend, and nostalgia was definitely there as well. So with that, we'll shift into Jon Last and talking about this consumer optimism barometer. So Jon, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thanks. As you talk about Taylor Swift, I can't help but recognize and remember that of all my social postings this year, the article I wrote for Media Post, I do a monthly column for Media Post, and I wrote about the Kelsey Swift romance, and it got like 7 times the engagement of even a typical post. I don't know if that's saying a bad thing about my typical post or a good thing about Taylor Swift, but I think I'm going to use the word Swift in every one of my posts going forward. And unknown and unbeknownst, the rumors out there are that there's potentially going to be a Taylor Swift cam at the Super Bowl on a special channel. Actually, I don't know if that's really going to happen.
I wouldn't mind it. I wouldn't doubt it. I wouldn't doubt it, Jon. I've heard that while she's on tour, she can make it back. So everybody,
she will be.
Rest assured, she's going to be there. And then, Fernando is still wondering who Taylor Swift is.
Yeah,
obviously, tongue in cheek, but
I was going to say we could send him a picture, but talking about pictures,
go ahead, Jon.
I want to kind of get into the current state of mind. I love the whole vibe session topic that Steve just kind of kicked us off with. As those of you who've been on this, watched this in the past, or have followed some of our work, we continue to do our consumer optimism barometer, which goes all the way back to COVID days, as you can see on this graph. This graph is actually tracking consumer sentiment across 2 different dynamics. One is top 3 box, 8, 9, or 10 agreement about optimism, whether people are optimistic about the future of our country. And you can see that number has really been in pretty much in a funk. Those orange bars, except for briefly hitting the 50 percentiles back at certain junctures during the pandemic, they have just kind of fallen and stayed right around the 30s and 40s. Throughout this year, and the blue line, which kind of runs through it, is an aggregation of a number of different attitudinal statements that we track about people's confidence. That number is at 66, and a score of 100 is kind of considered average or where you want to go. So lots of data that continues to demonstrate this vibe session that seems to be driving people's attitudes and behaviors. Another one on the next slide that we've been looking at for quite some time. We asked people how much they agree about whether the U.S. is on the right track. And you can see that less than a third actually strongly agree that we are. And we cross-tab that data across people based on ideology or age. It's pretty much across the board that people are just not happy with the direction that we're going into. And of course, you always kind of look at the end of the year and hope that people kind of have that forward look that we saw from Janice's 2-headed sculpture, that they're looking ahead and hopefully thinking that things are going to get better. But that really wasn't the case. And I think one of the big drivers of it, Steve, you mentioned this a little bit before, if we go to the next slide, is inflation. And lots of interesting data about inflation. What we're showing on this particular slide, and you can look back all the way to February of last year, we've got this data going back quite some time. The blue and yellow segments of these bars are the percentage of people who feel that compared to before the pandemic, prices are either much higher or somewhat higher. And we are still at this being an issue for over 70% of Americans. Now, what kind of accelerates this and is really interesting, and I was talking with an economist friend of mine last week, who I'll throw out a stat from him that just blew me away. A lot of the narrative that's out there is suggesting that inflation is getting better. And what I think, a lot of people see and believe incorrectly is that it's not that the rate of inflation is getting lower, in that, prices are getting lower. That would be deflation. What it is just that the pace with which prices are getting higher isn't as steep as it was in the past. And when people forget about that, prices are still getting higher. And the stat that blew me away from my economist friend was that literally, if we looked at people before the pandemic and now, they would need an average of $11,000 to $14,000 more per year in income to be able to replicate the standard of living that they enjoyed pre-COVID. So if you want to know why people are upset and you want to know why inflation still is this pervasive issue, it's costing people on average $11,000 to $14,000 more to maintain their lifestyle. So, great. Maybe next month it'll only be 14,000 and 200. That's still higher, and it's still really weighing on consumers. The other thing that's going on in lockstep with this, which we look at on our next slide, is there's a lot of issues that people are concerned with. And a couple that we've been tracking for quite some time have been people's opinions about the economy and its impact on personal finances, which are reflected by the two green curves here, and people's attitudes on crime. And we can see that at least from November to December, both of those from a society macro standpoint, did begin to trend back upward again. And I mean, you go back and see where we were in the peaks, in the depths of 2022, and these are not necessarily trending in the right direction. To keep things, moving from a perspective standpoint, and I don't mean to be the voice of gloom and doom, because there's a lot of good data out there, but on our next slide is what we look at consistently each month in terms of what are the issues that people are really concerned about. We ask people how serious these issues are for the country. And these are the percentages of people that say that these are very serious, 8, 9, or 10 on a 10-point scale. And I show the last 2 months data. Actually, January is just back in, but we're in the process of analyzing it. And you can see a number of different dynamics going on here, and I'll point out a few of them to you. Inflation continues to top the list. 57% of the population are very concerned and find inflation to be a very serious issue. And if you go across, you can see that that's an issue for everybody, regardless of what your political persuasions may be. Crime, gun violence come in second and third, but you see some real variations in some of these in terms of what people think about. Steve mentioned, some of the issues from a climate standpoint. 42% of people find that to be very serious, but only 29% of people who lean to the right. So no big surprise. We certainly see different narratives out there, and by looking at a number of these different issues, you can see that there is continuing to be a real divisiveness in the country based on a lot of these different issues that are most pervasive. But as we think about the upcoming election and we think about what weighs on consumers' mindsets, these are the areas that people have been expressing the greatest levels of concern with, and we look at it across a number of different dynamics. We're also seeing from a financial standpoint on the next slide, some interesting trending in terms of people's thoughts about recession. Obviously, there's an official definition of recession of 2/4 of GDP, though I guess declining, though I guess the last time we saw that, for some reason, they didn't call it a recession. But only 38% are very concerned or very much agree that we are currently in recession. That's actually trending better than where we were back in March of last year. And in lockstep at the end of the year, from a holiday spending standpoint, certainly what we've seen with certain retail numbers out there, there are a number of people, a majority of people, that do feel that they are a little bit more budget conscious right now than they were 2 years ago. That didn't stop them from spending. I think Steve's comments about the credit situation are ones that we shouldn't take for granted. And if you look on this next slide, you can see that in terms of people's attitudes about whether they're spending more or less on multiple items based on price increases, whether they are making more difficult decisions about discretionary purchases, you can see that under a majority are letting that affect them. So whether this is still revenge spending coming back from COVID, whether this is still people kind of seeing themselves in a different vein than others, it hasn't really impacted spending. And one of the theories that I tend to find pretty compelling out there is this whole theory of what's called a K-shaped recovery. And what that basically suggests in simplistic terms is that we're seeing the impacts of these economic squeezes and stresses affect people more who are not professional or are in the lower bands of the income range. The people that are more highly compensated, that are doing better professionally, are seeming to be less impacted by this, at least in their behaviors. And that's a particularly compelling statistic for a lot of the verticals that we deal with, in that it has certainly spurred on greater participation and greater spending throughout them, particularly at the luxury levels. But the concern that we have, and a lot of the work that we've been doing on a proprietary basis, is what's going to happen with everybody else? When and is the other shoe going to drop? And will that have, some potential impact as we get further into 2024, particularly in light of the fact that a number of these folks have been raising prices with some consistency. We have seen that quite a bit. So we will want to look at these numbers and see how they continue to track over the coming months. Also impacting this and depicted on the next slide is that we are beginning to see on the next slide that layoffs are back in the mix a little bit. We've moved slightly from 33% that feel that they are seeing an increase in layoffs to just under 40% now. That is just outside the range of being statistically significant. So again, something that we will want to keep an eye on as we go forward. But again, it hasn't necessarily impeded spending. On the next slide, we show you a little bit of a look at people's attitudes about whether this is the right time to make major purchases. Again, I wouldn't get overly enthusiastic. About 28% strongly agreeing that now is an excellent time to purchase real estate or a new car. But that is up from the depths of what we saw late in the fall this year as people kind of move forward. And then looking on the next slide, just about attitudes as a whole and looking at this across a number of different cuts, we ask people what is their level of confidence as they head into the year ahead. You can see that under half of the total population in the U.S. strongly agree that 24 will be a better year than 23. If you lean Democrat, you are much more excited about what may be out there in the year ahead, particularly compared to Republicans and independents, and particularly compared to those youngest Americans, as well as those in the older age bands that you can see going down this. So as we go there, Steve, you mentioned something that was really interesting in the TV data. As we go to our next slide, nostalgia really is an interesting theme that we may see continue to be a big marketing driver and trigger. Here we're asking people their opinions about whether the world was a better place than it was when they were growing up. And you can see that 62% of everybody overall agrees with that. And it's pretty much a majority across all of these different cuts in terms of people kind of yearning for the past. A couple of other quick things before I turn it back over. On the next slide, we've all heard a little bit about electric vehicles. And, Steve, you're out in California, a state where there's been a real desire to kind of make them mandatory in the near term. We've seen rental car companies as well as a number of the manufacturers kind of scale back their expectations about the adoption curve for electric vehicles. And certainly we are seeing that again in consumer attitudes. Just over a third of the total population strongly believe that transitioning to EVs is essential for the long-term sustainability of society. But boy, what a difference if you look at this again from an ideological lens. And then,
that's crazy.
Yeah,
I'm just looking at that, John. That's wild.
It is. And we've been asking it for time, and there's been a bit of movement on it. The next thing I'll show you is just, again, kind of taking a little bit of a look at social media. Again, this is kind of a half empty, half full thing, whether it's all things considered is social media a net positive. When you throw this all together, the total agreement is a majority that feel it's a net positive, but it's a little bit split between the power of that agreement and interestingly, where there's the greatest endorsement of it tends to be in those ages 25 to 44, as opposed to the younger or older bands from what we've looked at. And then finally, before I throw it over, one other look, not again to pick on Taylor Swift, but, there's all this talk about generational entitlement and are people today more in it for themselves and for the betterment of society. And the majority of the country does believe that people are more selfish today than in their parents' generation. But an interesting observation, if you look at that strongly agree segment on all of these and you kind of go down, the older you get, the more likely you are to strongly agree with that. So, maybe we're sounding a little curmudgeonly if we talk about how selfish people are today, but that's what that's looking like. So I will throw it back over to you guys and we'll continue with some more thoughts about where things are heading in the future.
Yeah, John, just be careful. You're going to get the Swifties after you if you keep talking that way. So
yeah,
just fair warning.
I thought I was on their good side because of what I wrote about in media posts, but maybe not.
That's true. No, you still have some clout there. So at least that's what my sources are saying. Anyway, Steve, go ahead. I'll let you take this one.
Your highly placed sources within the Swift camp. So
That's right. Yep, that's right.
yeah. Well, let's transition a little bit and talk a little bit more about the future. Famous quote attributed to Niels Bohr: "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future." I know when I was a kid and I would ever ask my dad, "What are we going to do tonight or tomorrow or next week?" He would always say, "If I could predict the future like that, I'd be at the racetrack." But we're going to give it our best shot. And as we go ahead to the next slide, you'll see we've been collecting some data on consumer expectations about the future for a while. So this is our most recent data that we just collected this month, January of 2024. And we asked about 12 different areas. The first 6 at the top of the slide, they're kind of personal things, and the next 6 in gray are more, broader cultural, societal issues. And we ask people to rate on a 10-point scale, how are things going today? And you see the numbers there in the left column. And then we also ask, well, how do you think these are going to be going at the end of the year, 2024? And you see them kind of averaged up there at the bottom. And basically what we see is that our expectations for the future are pretty much to remain the same. And even the ratings of what things are like today aren't great. They're, for those personal dimensions ranging from, 6.5 to maybe 7.5 in terms of how these various aspects of society are going. Numbers are a lot lower from, the 4.5 to 5.5 range. But I think what's really telling is that difference between how we rate it today and what we expect the future to be like. And as we go ahead to the next slide, we'll see we've actually been tracking this for a while. The very first wave of this we did back in a summer. It was July of 2020. And if you think of July of 2020, well, the pandemic had just kicked in. The pandemic really started, lockdowns and so on in March of 2020. So if you think back to July of 2020, there was a big gap between how we thought things were going today and how things were going to be in the future. We were expecting the future was going to be a lot better. We thought, oh, this pandemic thing, it'll be around for a few weeks. In the meantime, we're all watching Tiger King and baking bread, and it's not going to be so bad. But as time has gone on, you see that gap between how we think about today and how we think about it in a year and a half has gotten smaller and smaller. Particularly if you look way over on the right for the January 2024 data, the average of all those personal dimensions was 6.9. What's it going to be like at the end of the year? 7.0. So that's essentially the same. So we're not really having a sense of optimism that things are really going to be getting better in our lives appreciably over the next year or so. So that's definitely, I think, part of this vibe session feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So we also have collected some tracking data on a number of attitudinal items that also reflect what we might describe as kind of a consumer malaise. So I'll let you absorb all of those. Obviously, there's a lot of frustration with how things are going politically, and a lot of concern about the election coming up, which we'll touch on again at the end of the presentation. But for now, I'll just call your attention to the bottom line there. The statement of young people today will be better off than their parents' generation. It's now at 22%. Significantly down from last year. It is an item that has bounced around a little bit, but this also speaks to this feeling. I mean, this was historically a core tenet of the American dream that things are going to be better off for my kids than for me. The next generation is going to get better and better and have more opportunities, and we really seem to be losing that. Again, another fundamental part of this vibe session. So as we go ahead to the next slide, we've also collected a number of items that kind of get at the notion of New Year's resolutions. What are you going to do more of this year? Where we give people a whole long list of things and say, what are you going to do more of? About the same, going to do less, or I don't do this at all. And I've shaded in blue the items where a lot more people are saying they're going to do more than do less. Maybe an unusual way to kind of look at the numbers, but I think that's the most telling of what's the broader trend in society going to be. What are the items where a lot more people are saying I'm going to do more of this as opposed to less of this? And really the items that come out of the top of the list are very much about prioritizing self-care, taking care of myself, dealing with stress, exercise, eating healthy. Sleep has a really big gap between more and less. That's one of those items where people don't really say, oh, I'm gonna sleep less. I'm sleeping too much. But I think you see the general theme there, which we've seen historically. People say they're going to prioritize these self-care items. Whether they do or not is a different question. But I think it's definitely more prominent and more prevalent as a theme in the marketplace. looking for things of, taking care of yourself, prioritizing, soothing kinds of mental health care activities, self-care, that kind of thing. The only item where we really have a big gap between, I'm going to do less versus more is way down at the bottom with drink alcohol. And again, that's a statement that sort of reads a little bit funny given the scale, how many people really say, oh, I'm going to drink more alcohol this year. But I think it's telling. There is kind of a trend toward a greater interest in sobriety, particularly among younger people. Mocktails are big, and we'll see this theme come up again with some of our other statements as we go ahead onto the next slide. So that's kind of a look at what people say they're going to do more or do less. We also ask a similar kind of question around spending. We give them a number of categories and say, what are you going to spend more on? So as you see at the top of the list, there is groceries. So a lot more people say I'm going to spend more on groceries and on less. I think that's primarily inflation, rather than people saying, oh, I'm really going to eat healthy. I'm going to buy all organic, and I'll have to spend some more for that. But it's kind of similar to, I just did an analysis that'll actually come out next week about holiday spending and where that ended up. And, kind of the headline that was out there from the National Retail Federation and the people who crunched those numbers say, oh, holiday spending was up this year, was up 3.8%. Well, inflation was at 3.4%. So that means basically people bought the same amount of stuff. They were just spending more for it because of inflation. And so I think that really captures the essence of those first couple of items. People say, oh, I got to spend more on groceries, more on insurance. It's because people, prices are rising, and not that, oh, this is a different way that I want to prioritize my spending. I think the third item on the list, personal care and wellness, is more of a reflection of people intentionally trying to achieve their goals that we saw on the previous slide. So again, I think that notion of self-care is going to be a big theme in 2024. Again, at the bottom, we've got more people saying, oh, I'm going to spend less on alcohol than spending more. I don't know how many people go into the year say, oh, I want to spend more on alcohol this year, or, I'm going to buy more premium spirits, or I'm really going to get my drink on. So, maybe that's a statement that's a little hard to interpret given this scale, but I do think it reflects that broader interest, particularly among younger consumers, of more of an interest in sobriety, whether it's total sobriety or what they call California sober, which is people who don't drink but smoke marijuana, and that is kind of a growing trend as well. So we'll see similar kind of themes as we go ahead to the next slide, where we asked about a number of different economic concerns. We asked about what are good investments at this time. And so you see the numbers there, the top of the list of what people are very concerned about with financial issues is keeping pace with inflation, not having enough money for retirement. Actually had 16% of people saying they're very concerned about becoming homeless. And if you look at the very bottom, we've got 47% of the population saying, I live from paycheck to paycheck. So it's just not a big financial cushion for a lot of people, which I think also contributes to that sense of the vibe session. It's hard to relax. There's kind of no sense of financial security about the future. So I think that's, like I said, pretty telling as well. Yeah. So we'll go ahead to the next slide. So I think we're getting toward the end, and we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. But I just wanted to give kind of a more qualitative look at what I think some of the themes are going to be for the coming year. We talked about self-care, prioritizing mental health, that kind of thing. As we look at some of the broader issues, news stories that might come up a lot, there is some good news if you put faith in the Chinese zodiac. This is the year of the dragon, which is generally a good omen. So expectations of more justice and prosperity and strength. So that's generally a positive issue. We're going to have the Olympics this year. June, I believe it's July and August 2024 in Paris. Last year, in the summer in Europe, incredible heat waves. So I think that may be as much of the story in terms of the coverage of the Paris Olympics. So not only is the whole world going to be turning its eyes toward thinking about Paris and competition and international relations as it takes place on that stage of sports, but I think there are going to be a lot of headlines about The weather there, the heat. Are they going to have to move some things indoors? Is there going to have to be more, ways to keep spectators cool? So I think that's going to be a set of headlines that we're going to see a lot. Kind of an interesting footnote is that scientists are predicting a big cicada outbreak. So there are lots of different broods of cicadas, they're called. Some reproduce on a 13-year cycle, some reproduce on a 17-year cycle. And so that means that every 221 years, the 13-year cicadas and the 17-year cicadas come out at the same time. And that's what's projected for, again, this summer, primarily in the Midwest. That's going to lead to all kinds of headlines. It's been 221 years, so Thomas Jefferson was in charge the last time that happened, but I think we'll be hearing a lot about that. And again, that's going to draw attention to broader issues about the environment. A couple of other things that I think we're going to hear a lot about. There's a really interesting report that comes out every year from the World Economic Forum, where they look at the global risks, and they do a big survey with all kinds of decision makers from different countries around the world. And what I thought was really interesting was, at least in the short term, next 2 years, their prediction for the largest risk is actually about disinformation and misinformation. Climate change comes in at number 2. When they do the projections for what's the biggest risk over 10 years, then climate change and related things kind of come out at the top. But in the near term, there's a lot of concern about misinformation, disinformation, particularly as we are headed to a whole slate of elections. Obviously, one of the things that contributes to the vibe session here in the U.S. is all the turmoil around the political landscape. And what I think is important to recognize, that's not just the United States, that there are a number of countries that have really big elections coming up, and often similar dynamics to what we see in this country, where there's kind of an authoritarian populist figure and questions about the future of democracy. As we asked in our data, just kind of open-ended what consumers are expecting from the coming year, we found that for them it was very difficult to predict because of all the uncertainty. It sort of depends on how the election goes. So that's something that people will be keeping a close eye on. So I think that's kind of our general take on the year that was and the year to come. And Dan, I think we probably have some questions coming in.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that have come in, and I would encourage you, if you do have questions, put them into the chat or the comments for whatever platform you're reviewing this on, and we will get them. People did submit questions beforehand, so I wanted to take a minute to talk about those. John, one of the questions that came up that I think you can answer, and Steve, feel free to weigh in on this, is around the tourism outlook for 2024. John, I know you obviously are deeply ingrained in this. Any sentiment there, or what are your thoughts there, John?
We're still seeing a fairly bullish attitude about travel. I mentioned the whole term about revenge spending, revenge travel, particularly as international markets, became a little volatile. There's still, in our data, we're still seeing a lot of strong desire to travel. I think even in the data that we just got back in January that Steve showed, the spending levels for travel seem to be slightly nominally higher and even statistically slightly higher. I am, as I mentioned in what I was going through my slides, I am a little bit concerned about price escalation and getting to that point of elasticity. So, one of the things that we're talking with a lot of our clients about is kind of formally looking at price elasticity and making sure that they don't price themselves too far out of the market. And even those that work, in a dynamic pricing environment, this can kind of help you make sure that you have the right entry point and, floor and ceiling. But overall, I think particularly in the luxury side, we are seeing still a growth story, at least through the first half of the year, and a real consumer appetite to get out there and travel. So I'm not anticipating, just as we've enjoyed some really good numbers the last couple of years, I don't see that dissipating. I am a little bit more concerned, as I mentioned, in more of the value side of the market.
Interesting. Last year, I remember we were talking a lot about revenge spending, right? People being pent up from COVID, getting out there, spending more. Do you guys see that trend continuing, or has that kind of leveled off?
It's still there. I will add one thing, and we a stat that we've been keeping in the barometer for quite some time is the ability of those activities and leisure pursuits to kind of come back and regain their mojo, if you will, from where they were pre-COVID. A lot of these activities, be it restaurants and certain resorts, people were not as optimistic that they or not as convinced that they were delivering the same type of experience that met their expectations or their recollections. We actually saw that shift. They really kind of caught up with it probably around the beginning of the spring, and it's been maintained. So from that standpoint, while I still see a lot of people actualizing this way, the competition, I think, is going to be fiercer than it has been, because a number of different activities that perhaps weren't as accessible or even meeting the expectations that people had have finally kind of gotten things back. And some of that, I think, has also been impacted by a slight improvement that we've seen in the labor situation. The labor situation is still pretty serious in a lot of leisure and discretionary businesses, but we've seen a little bit of a weakening of that stress from what we saw a year ago.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Steve, anything on revenge spending? Now, I think you were the first one I heard use that term, so I'll see what you have to say about that.
Okay, another term that I use a lot but didn't coin.
Yeah.
I don't know who coined it, but it was a good phrase. I think just the fact that consumer debt is up is an indicator of that revenge spending. Hey, I don't really have money, but I'm going to go out and spend it anyway.
Yeah.
So I do think that's also going to reflect this year's kind of those credit cards become due. I think credit card companies are going to cut back a little bit on the amount of credit that they offer, and you're going to see like a decline in offer of balance transfers and so on that maybe a lot of people had used to kind of fuel some of their spending. In terms of travel, I do see definite, continued pent up demand for travel. I think a lot of times it's going to be more budget oriented travel, value oriented travel. So I see a lot these days about cruises, and particularly talking about, look, we're going to offer these low prices, and you compare that to how many dollars a day you're spending on the cruise versus other kinds of vacation options. There've been a lot of headlines about that big. Various big around the world 3-year cruises that have attracted a lot of interest. Maybe it's just what I see in my social media feed. I know on one of those cruises that was projected to be multi-year around the world, I saw a video where they got all the people on the cruise who were influencers and who were documenting what was going on social media, and it was huge. It was a room full of people all documenting it. So maybe that's just
Interesting.
What sort of we get a misleading perception of it because we see it in social media so much. But I think that kind of budget oriented travel is going to be a growing trend. I also see, and this is certainly a niche, not a really widespread thing, but I think a lot of baby boomers getting toward retirement, looking at their numbers, wondering if they can really afford the lifestyle they want to have in retirement here in the United States. So I think, again, a lot of older baby boomers looking at becoming expats, many going to Mexico. This is something I see a lot of content on as well. Oh, if you want to retire overseas, here are the 10 best countries. And, it's Mexico, it's countries in Eastern Europe, Spain, Portugal. I think people are looking at, what's the cost of living? What kind of healthcare can I afford? And I think a lot of people are increasingly seeing retirement in the United States as unaffordable. So I think that's another trend we're going to see.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And then, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier around what the trends were and what people said around what they're going to be spending their money on and what they're interested in. A lot of it was around, health and wellness and what can I do to improve that? Maybe again, it's my social media feed and I'm trying to be more healthy and well, but and it's probably a little bit anecdotal, but I see a lot of that. And obviously it shows through in the data. It's probably not anything new, but it feels like there's more of a push towards like longevity, health, and just general awareness out there. Have you guys seen that at all? Obviously, I know we saw it on this data, but elsewhere at all, have you been seeing that?
We've certainly seen it in some of the leisure and fitness work that we've done. There's been a lot of focus on those as amenities, both at resorts and golf clubs and the like. That's probably something that it's not unique to this year, but definitely it's reflected, I think, in some of the offerings that restaurants have come out with. There's a lot more focus on people with different dietary restrictions.
Mhm.
So I think, and I think people have gotten more creative in terms of, one of the trends that we saw in the golf industry, where we spend a lot of time, is a real focus on upgrading the F&B effort as a whole. And that has been such to create not only environments that are more conducive to a broader audience, but also to offer food options that are a little bit more creative and also probably a little bit more healthy. I guess I can also be a little bit anecdotal too. I'm a lot thinner than I was the last time we had this session,
Yeah.
which is reflective of my own sample of one.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and I do think there is going to be a continued focus on mental health. Again, a lot of this is led by younger consumers. I think there was the notion of, it used to be, you'd drink away your sorrows. You'd go out, you have some friends you go out with, and you have some alcohol, and that was a way of dealing with kind of mental health problems. And I definitely see a kind of a growing backlash against that. One phrase that I would toss out, and I think I did invent this one. I haven't seen it elsewhere.
Okay.
I think we're going to hear about big booze. So there's big tobacco. There was big soda for a while, and now it's going to be big booze. And hey, these companies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising, and it's not good for people. It causes health problems. It's actually a really counterproductive way to try to deal with things like anxiety and depression. So I think we're going to see a lot more of a national discussion about alcohol.
All right. So big booze. You heard it here first in 2024. And all right. Big booze. You're coining that term, Steve.
I like it.
I like it. Kind of one question we brought up, and we can touch on it. And if there's not much, that's totally fine. I think everyone wants to think that, kind of COVID is beyond us. Firsthand account, I know it's not. I had it about a month ago. So it's still there, but it feels like people aren't talking about it. Maybe it's not being reported as much. Obviously, it's not as much in the news cycle. But we did get an interesting question that I wanted to ask you guys around, how will COVID continue to impact shopper behavior? And if it will, if it won't, and what your guys' thoughts are around that.
We did ask that. It was on one of the slides where we listed the biggest concerns that people had, and I think about 35% of the overall country was very concerned still about public health. In December of 23, that was another one that also, interestingly, like everything, I guess, had its partisan variation. I'm looking at the numbers now. 44% of those that were blue, and 29% of those who were red. I think we've learned a lot from this, and having done a lot of research on it, I think that there were a lot of mistakes that were made that people are going to be more mindful about, both in creating an environment that people feel they have greater control over, but also in terms of not trying to accelerate certain reactions to it. Again, it was interesting. I was talking to a physician friend of mine over the weekend, and he's like, COVID's still here, but it's something that we now know what to do with. And I believe that message has kind of gotten through to most people, based on the data that we have. It's not going to impede what folks do. I think to your question about retail, though, we've been seeing for years the migration from bricks and mortar to a more time efficient way of e-commerce, and in a lot of the verticals that we look at, that continues to be the trend. But I think one has to be very selective based upon the category, because there are still certain categories where people feel that the ability to touch and feel and experience things is going to be a differentiator in making a purchase decision. They may still they may still go and ultimately transact digitally, but there's still a desire to go out and be with products. And something that we've seen in kind of the retail space and malls, there's definitely been more of a trend towards building these mixed use centers that are less, exclusively retail centric, but also include places to live, places to do work. Just because, again, I didn't show the slide, we're still looking at 50% plus of the white collar population working at least some of the time away from an office setting. That's not changing. So these mixed use developments have a combination of dining options, retail options, and living options. And you talk about trends. I just want to go back on the real estate side, something that we looked at recently in some of that work. So you've got that one stat from the consumer side of about 51% that are still working either hybrid or exclusively at home. I think I saw that the national rate of available, of office inventory was 21%. Now, that doesn't sound so large, but recognize that there's probably about another 25% that are subleased. So we don't know what the status is of that space we use. So you put those together, you're in like 30-40% of open office space, and that all of that real estate's going to need to be examined and looked at and possibly repurposed. So that's something to really be mindful of in the year ahead.
Yeah, and that has to your point, has a big downstream effect too, right? If people aren't going to the office, they're not going out to eat, those places that relied on that. So, and that obviously has a big effect. So, Steve, any thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I kind of see a lot of that firsthand here in San Francisco, where used to be a very vibrant downtown, particularly in terms of work culture and so many big influential companies. I do think commercial real estate is going to be in a challenge for a while, but I also think that among consumers, there's a humongous desire to get back to normal, whatever that is. And so getting back to our COVID discussion, I think that by and large, people are collectively, when they hear stats about COVID and it's still out there and still, waves of COVID coming in, that it's kind of like when you tell a little kid something they don't want to hear and they cover up their ears and they're like, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. I think we have recalculated our assessment of risk. And there's a sense of, COVID's a risk, but we gotta go on. We gotta live our lives. We gotta do things. Right. So I just think there's a different calculation of what risk is in our lives. And I think a lot of people are saying, well, what's the bigger risk for me? Is it getting COVID, or is it kind of, living in fear or living in my house all the time? And, I'm willing to take my chances, I think, is the mindset right now.
I don't know if you guys have seen this too, but there's also, it continues to be this reallocation and reprioritization of time. I didn't put some of these slides up, but we've been asking that in the barometer for quite a while, and we've certainly been looking at it from a leisure activity standpoint. That was always a huge inhibitor for a lot of, the ways that people spent their time. And, when you were committed and locked down to a dedicated work environment during traditional hours, that had its implications for a lot of discretionary spending. And now, as we continue to see the foundational solidity, if you will, of, hybrid work environments, it does give people, I think, a little bit more flexibility. Plus, I think generationally, we're certainly seeing trends that certainly speak to a different prioritization of work within the whole work-life balance equation. It may not seem like something new, but we just continue to see the resiliency of those trends, and even a slight buildup in people that place a premium on that, which obviously has a lot of implications for a number of the verticals that we work in, and just things like travel and sports that we've been talking about.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's a good point. One of the other things I wanted to mention and to bring up, and there was a couple of questions around this. We touched on it a little bit, but that was, crime and how that impacts, consumers and behaviors. Steve, I think I read yesterday that a famous toy store in San Francisco closed down yesterday because of, the crime that's happening in these major cities. And certainly that bared through in the numbers, right? Crime is obviously, something that people care a lot about and are concerned about. Any thoughts on that? I don't know really what the question is, but your thoughts around crime and its impact, and if it'll get better or not, or what your guys' thoughts are there.
Yeah, well, if you listen to the media, San Francisco is just overrun with crime, and and it's interesting. There had been some big, high-profile, in-person store closures in San Francisco, but there've also been a lot of analyses of that, because these companies will shut down their in-person stores and say, well, there's too much crime, and then when people actually go in and look at the crime statistics, they're not actually closing the stores in the highest crime neighborhoods. They're closing the stores that are least profitable for them. And, saying, it's because of crime, that sort of gives them sort of this political cover, and it sort of feeds into a certain narrative. I think there's actually an interesting study that came out. I think it was actually by my former employer, Ipsos, although I could be wrong on that, where it asked people, is crime getting worse? Is crime getting better? The majority of people say crime is getting worse. That was true across all political groups, particularly among Republicans, but it was still a majority of Democrats as well saying crime is getting worse. Crime's going down. Like if you look at FBI statistics, government statistics, crime is going down. And so it speaks to, what's the political narrative out there?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Media outlets that are motivated to scare people, to paint certain parts of the country as disasters that we have to clean up. It gets back to that notion of disinformation and misinformation is going to be one of the biggest challenges coming up in the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point for sure. John, any thoughts on that?
I haven't looked at those statistics. I guess the one question that I would ask, to kind of play a counterpoint to Steve's, not that I necessarily agree with this point, but I'll throw it out there. Haven't we also seen the definition of what constitutes crime become more relaxed in recent years? And could that be contributing to the statistic that you just saw? I think, again, when we look at people's attitudes, particularly on one side of the aisle, which, as we look at both sides, there seems to be a feeling that, we've become more permissive as a society and that it's become more difficult to convict and prosecute crimes. That's definitely a narrative that is out there. And, as researchers, we have to listen to both, to all different extremes of narratives. So it's hard to say. I mean, our data seems to say, and I think we all agree on it, that there is this perception that things are a little bit more dicey than they were. But as with everything, unfortunately, and I totally concur with the fact that you just have to be so mindful and careful of the sourcing that you're getting a lot of these perceptions from. I've made it a habit, not just as a researcher, but as a consumer, to regularly consume content from extremes, as well as, I can't even suggest that there's a middle that you can even read. And it's amazing to continuously see how similar circumstances are being reported in vastly different ways. And it makes it really hard for people to really know what's going on.
Yeah, interesting. Well, shifting gears here, and Steve, this is maybe a question for you, and John, feel free to chime in here as well. I guess probably a student asked, are the 2023 consumer trends relevant for university students studying business commerce? If so, can you explain how?
Yeah, well, I am a college professor, so I'm obviously tuned into that world of higher education, and the world of higher education is having problems. Now, in part, it's a weird market. It's different from other markets in that college enrollments are largely predicted by what were birth rates 18 years ago. So when there are a lot of 18-year-olds, a lot of them go to college, and then enrollments are good and colleges are flush, and they will, continue to raise prices. So if we look back 18 years ago, birth rates were going down, and we're now coming up on the 18th anniversary of the 2008 financial crisis, which is when birth rates really took a hit. And so in education, they call that the demographic cliff. So there are, a lot of colleges that are seeing declining enrollments. We've even seen a few colleges, go out of business, and you don't really think of colleges as, completely shutting down and going out of business. But that is a reality. We've seen some universities really try to get creative and really embrace online education at a lower cost. So there are places like Arizona State, where they have over 100,000 students. A place like Liberty University, which you may know best as the school that Jerry Falwell built, has over 100,000 students because they've really embraced online education. And I think just in general, a lot of people are questioning the value of a college degree because prices just went up and up and up. And now there's so many alternatives to that, young people in tech don't necessarily need to go get a college degree. There are a lot of certification programs. You can go out and get some specific training that, are a fraction of the cost of a college education. So I think higher education is really going to need to reinvent itself very quickly.
It's a great point. We asked some questions also. Certainly there's been a lot of question. Again, this depends on what narrative you're listening to about trust in what is, the content. I mean, you live it day to day. Lots of questions about, how comfortable students feel about their abilities to express themselves, within a college environment. And, again, we've asked that, and, it seems to be fairly split a lot along ideological lines, but, I don't think we recall it being that way two decades or a couple generations ago, and that may also be contributing to that lack of or that decline in perceived value that is making it more challenging.
Yeah, no, I think you're 100% right. All right, guys. Well, I think that's probably a good way to wrap it up. Definitely stay connected with us. If you want, do a live show every Friday at 11 Central. So look for that on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, or wherever you get your social media. Typically, we're there, and then do a newsletter, and also the podcast format of Live with Dan. So all of these things are ways that you can stay connected with me and what QuestionPro is doing. Steve, I wanted to give you a second. I know you have an exciting opportunity here that I wanted to let you give you a few minutes to speak on.
Yeah, so as I said, I teach at the University of San Francisco, primarily in our MSMI program, so Master of Science in Marketing Intelligence. So that's a graduate program, and I also run our practicum program for that degree program. So I pair companies that need market research projects with teams of graduate students to tackle those projects. I supervise the students. They conduct secondary research, qualitative research, and quantitative research, and write up a final insights-based, recommendations-oriented report. It's very inexpensive for clients because they don't have to pay for the student's time or for my time. They only need to pay for out-of-pocket expenses like respondent incentives. And so it's a really good opportunity. It's a learning opportunity for students. It's a way that companies can get market research on the cheap. So I would encourage people to think about that, and I would love to collaborate with folks.
Great. That sounds like a great opportunity. Cool. And then Jon, I'll let you say a few words here.
Obviously, those who want to dive deeper into some of the things that we're doing in the barometer and some of the other industry-specific studies, we've actually begun doing some currency for the American Resort Developers Association that those in the travel space will be seeing. We continue to track the golf market also in more of a public-facing way. But you can get all of that, plus general ramblings and ruminations through our News and Views newsletter. Just throw me an email at the email address below. You can follow me on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it these days, as well as on LinkedIn. And, obviously would love to kind of continue the conversation with those who are willing to do so.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. And thanks, everyone, for attending the webinar today. And with that, we can go ahead and wrap it up.
Thanks again.